Prior to October 1929, the Brazilian economy was dependent on agriculture, particularly coffee. While rubber, cotton, cocoa were also key cash crops, coffee dominated Brazilian exports. In the 1920s, coffee exports were the source of over 70% of the country's revenue. Incredibly lopsided reliance on GDP and on coffee. Brazilian producers had to strike a delicate balance to prevent this overproduction while having enough to maximize profits. You produce too much, then the price collapses. So they did this little balancing act. This was not always easy, as the trade was reliant on the whims of the international market, over which Brazilian producers had no control. Now, to take more control, in 1925, Brazil created something called the Sao Paulo Institute for the Permanent Defense of Coffee. Let me stop for a minute and say that Sao Paulo is both a state and a city in Brazil, both of the most populous most populous city and most populous state, and much coffee production was centered around Sao Paulo in the 1920s and 30s. Sao Paulo today is enormous, well over 10 million people. It's the largest city in the southern half of the Western Hemisphere. So anyway, they created the Sao Paulo Institute for the Permanent Defense of Coffee. To keep coffee prices high, the institute would purchase and withhold its goods from the world market. It's not unlike the sub-treasury plan the populists wanted in America in the 1890s. To pay for the coffee, the institute received revenue from a transportation tax and took out loans from foreign banks. You see the potential danger there. This policy was known as valorization, and it was potentially dangerous as Brazilian coffee producers wanted to expand their markets, and other Latin American countries were increasing their production of coffee, thereby limiting Brazil's dominance of the international market. The policy was successful in the 1920s. In 1927, Brazil produced an all-time high of 27 million bags of coffee, and as world prices began to fall, the Institute bought more coffee and prevented a substantial decrease in price. Then, in 1928, when the coffee crop was small and the stocks they had purchased were placed on the market, and not only did prices hold, but there were substantial reserves of coffee to be sold. So for a while this process worked. By the way, the Institute for Permanent Defense of Coffee is not unlike a monopsony, the wheat board set up by the Canadians, although it didn't buy all the coffee, just enough to buttress the value. Now, it wasn't all coffee. There was a small emerging industrial base in several cities, but it was limited, very small. Most manufactured goods came from overseas, meaning that most profits from the export of coffee were spent overseas for manufactured goods, and there was a substantial outflow of capital. While some Brazilians advocated protectionist tariffs to keep foreign goods out and tax credits to stimulate domestic industrialization, they were largely ignored by policymakers. On the eve of the Depression, Brazil's foreign debt was $900 million, and the government paid out approximately $170 million a year in the repayment of loans, the service on that debt. And they relied on the profits of the export trade, principally on coffee, to make those annual payments. As long as coffee values remained high, the system worked to Brazil's advantage. But in May of 1929, the price of coffee began a very fast decline. In Brazil, there had been 2 years of bumper crops leading to a huge surplus. Other countries in the region had also achieved a leap in their output, flooding the market, therefore lowering the price. This weakened Brazil's economic standing, and foreign lenders began to limit credit on them. They began to see what was going to happen. Brazilian banks, in turn, began to cut back their liberal lending to coffee planters. Nonetheless, the Institute declared that its policies were sound and no changes would be made, and gave Brazilians a false sense of security. Now, the Wall Street crash of 1929 had a devastating impact on Brazil's export economy, highlighting the problems of the economic system that Brazil had in place. In September of 1929, coffee was being sold at 22 cents per pound. By December 1st, it had fallen to 15 cents. That's a one-third drop in just a few months. And given that coffee was 70% of Brazil's GDP, well, you can see how devastating that was. it meant that national income declined and government revenue declined. The state of Sao Paulo was in especially dire straits because of its reliance on coffee and faced bankruptcy. It appealed to the federal government for assistance, but this was denied by President Washington Luiz. I don't know much about him. I don't know if he was named Washington, which is not a Portuguese name, in hopes he would become president, but that'd be an interesting story. He had been an opponent of coffee valorization earlier in his political career as governor of Sao Paulo, but when elected president had said that the economy was dependent upon valorization. Following the Wall Street crash, he reverted to his previous outlook and stated that an unhealthy economic situation had been created through valorization that would be difficult to recover from. Instead, he favored development of the small and commercial industrial sectors. He joined those voices that said we need to start developing other industry. Now, this national economic decline had profound effects for local businesses. In an informal report, the Sao Paulo opposition paper Diário Nacional reported that shop owners said they'd seen a 40% decline in sales in December of 1929 alone. Imports were drastically reduced. Couldn't afford them anymore. Trade stagnated, and the smaller industrial sector sat idle. Planters, the great planters who often lived in the city, returned to their plantations. They were resentful of Washington Luiz's policies, seeing the decline in prices as temporary and his unwillingness to help them change their political orientation. Same pattern we're seeing elsewhere in the Americas with the Depression. Whoever's in charge gets blamed for doing too little. At the same time, a new presidential race was looming between, I believe it's pronounced, Getulio Vargas and Julio Prestes. Prestes was the handpicked successor of Washington Luiz. He was a good friend of his, in fact. Now, in an astute political move, Vargas both stated support for coffee valorization, which, Luiz had seemed to be moving away from, and he also stated support for the financial propositions Luiz had recommended that coffee, not coffee, but that the industrial sector had to be built through various means. So he said both things should be done. It was a smart thing to do. It increased his popularity among most Brazilians. But even so, in the March 1930 elections, it appeared that Prestes won a narrow victory, which gave an assurance to foreign investors of Brazil's political solvency. They placed their stock with the existing administration, and almost immediately credit was extended to the ailing state of Sao Paulo, which was supposed to use that money, the part that wasn't used to borrow to service debts. About 50% of it was used to buy coffee, the coffee surplus, and stabilize the price. Instead, a record-breaking 29 million bags of coffee were produced, and prices, which had stabilized at about 14 cents a pound, dropped anew. Coffee prices fell to 10 cents per pound, and the economy was dangerously close to collapsing. At the same time, Brazil's debt had increased to about 1.2 billion, three-quarters of which was owed by the government of Brazil. They had also seriously depleted their gold reserves, which stood at about 70 million. So additionally, the overthrow of governments in neighboring states made European and American lenders very reluctant to invest further in Brazil. This all happens after the election of Prestes in only a few weeks. Approximately 1 million Brazilians were affected by the economic crisis. Most Brazilian rural workers were landless laborers that planters could no longer afford to pay. They began to subsist on food they planted between coffee trees and faced hunger. Those who could migrated to the cities in search of work, but just as many remained behind, unemployed and disgruntled. Unemployment was also rife among urban workers, including civil servants. Those government workers, even who retained their jobs, were often unpaid for months at a time. While there were few civil disturbances, amazingly, the country seemed poised for a change, and that change was about to come through Vargas.